Tony Travers is a professor in the LSE School of Public Policy and the Department of Government. He's a member of the Mayor's London Recovery Board and has recently co-edited a book on London's mayors at 20, governing a global city in the 21st century. So Tony, I mean, you've said that planning policy will be important in determining the longer term future of London's international core, suburbs and semi-rural edge, and that unless we return city centres to economic health, there'll be permanent bad consequences for export generating tourism, the theatre, music, civil aviation, public transport, higher education, museums, legal sector, actually almost everything that makes up a proper global city. So the key deliverables which have been set out by the Recovery Board don't actually mention the shape of the city. They don't mention likely population shifts or even how to cater for changing work and travel patterns, in contrast, say, to Anne Hidalgo in Paris and her support for La Ville de Quart d'Heure. I mean, isn't that a serious omission? Don't we need to see if the London plan is still fit for purpose? Or should we revive the urban task force even?
Well, that's a big and interesting and important question, and definitely I think policymakers, not only in London but across the UK and in other cities around the world, are going to have to address this question about whether their existing planning arrangements and systems are up to coping with the adaptations that are about to occur as a result of locking down the economy and then moving out of a lockdown, assuming we eventually do, and quite what the changes that will then be revealed, as the tide goes out, as it will, comes back in this case. So we are going to witness changes, and I think, in fairness to both the Transition Board, which I'm not on, and the Recovery Board that I am, is that in a sense they, like much government policy at the national level, are having to try to deal with a world where it's very, very hard to predict what everything's going to be like, how many people are going to work at home, how many people will want to return to using public transport, how will international air travel and tourism recover, and at what speed. So for the time being, I think in a sense it's safest to assume that most cities, including London, will want to get back to something like the status quo before, but of course they'll want to do it in a better way. And whether you can pick and choose exactly how this happens, I don't know. It depends how strong the economy is as we move back into a recovery, or move into a recovery phase, as opposed to the current sort of hibernation stage.
So I thought it's very interesting in your chapter on the evolving mayoralty that you highlight one thing that each mayor has done. And the things you highlighted were congestion charge for Ken, bicycles for Boris, and pollution for Sadiq, which are all sort of road transport related, and interesting that they are about streets as public spaces which need to be improved. So, but it's probable that Sadiq's biggest test will be to sort out the post-pandemic public transport system, isn't it? So getting the infrastructure right must be key to recovery. And so I know that Crossrail 2 is a bit on the back burner at the moment, but do we need to try and push for that and the Bakerloo line extension, or is it improving outer London more orbital movement to take into account the fact that more people are likely to be working from home and outside the central activity zone in the future?
Well, there's no question that, I mean, one of the main responsibilities that the three mayors have had is for transport. It's where they've been able to act most effectively, or transport and roads and the use of roads. And therefore it's, in a sense, I think, not surprising that that's where they've, in all three cases, really had their greatest impact. You could say that in planning and housing policy, that particularly Boris Johnson, I think, was building a substantial number of homes in very different economic circumstances, by the way, towards the end of his 8 years in power. But transport is where mayors have a lot of capacity to change things and to deliver. I think one of the biggest challenges facing the winner of the 2021 postponed mayoral election will be working with national government to get people back onto public transport. So much of the messaging about COVID has been about not meeting people, not going into crowded places, staying away from danger. And of course, that's inimical not only to public transport, but actually a whole range of other things that dense, crowded city centres always relied on. In a sense, they relied on people being close together, doing now. Some of that will come back because I think a number of people, particularly younger people, probably don't feel as threatened as others do by COVID. But some of the messaging, I think, will stick, and people are going to think, well, you know, do I have to do that commute in those slightly awkward circumstances? Now, against that backdrop, then, if fewer people commute, it will mean fewer people in the city centre. Central London and other city centres rely on people travelling in and out every day for their vitality and for the ecosystem that exists. So personally, I think that getting people back comfortable with travelling and into public spaces with lots of other people is absolutely essential for the central part of London, and actually for some of the other town centres in London, which at a smaller scale rely on the same thing. I just don't think in the end other cities all around the world are going to sprawl, and we must ensure that if London does that, it does it in a way that's thought through and doesn't have a whole range of unintended consequences.
So in your interview with Sadiq Khan, he said, one of my jobs is to persuade them, the Tories, to calm down on the party political rhetoric. And Robert Jenrick has been using the new London plan as a stick to beat the mayor with, but equally Sadiq has been openly critical of the government's handling of the COVID crisis. So there is clearly a split between the two. I mean, so how do you see the future relationship of City Hall and Whitehall? And do you think those tensions will hinder London's recovery?
Well, the difficulty in the short term is that because of the postponed mayoral election, the mayoral election period is not just 9 months to a year, but it's almost 2 years and so that does politicize the relationship more than it would normally be. And I think once we get past the election, both the mayor, whoever it is, and the government will kind of have to treat each other with a degree more civility. At least I hope they do. You mentioned Robert Jenrick's intervention on the London plan. I mean, personally, I think that tells us, and not for the first time, how uncomfortable British politicians at the national level, and I don't just mean Robert Jenrick, it's true of other secretaries of state in other parties in the past, they just can't help themselves intervening in subnational government. You know, we've got London's city of 9 million people with a political class well easily able to make its own decisions about, you know, what kind of housing we want, what kind of planning, what kind of tall buildings, and. So in a sense, we've ended up with 3 levels of government. And I think that the central government needs to accept that, not only in London, but in the West Midlands, Birmingham, Greater Manchester, that more power needs to be devolved there and rather fewer detailed interventions about really quite minor things of a kind that we get from ministers, not only in fairness at the Communities Department, but in transport and other parts of government.
But I know you supported the idea of devolution and written reports which recommend it. But in the book, you suggest, I think, that there might be 3 different routes that it could go down, but the most likely one is just continuing very much the same with a bit of tinkering as we go on. Is that what you think is most likely to happen?
Well, as I say, successive governments of all parties, even though in fairness to the Blair-Brown government, they introduced the current system of, well, it was the Blair government at that time, but introduced devolution to Scotland and Wales and the current system of citywide government in London. And there has been, both under Labour and Conservative governments, in some slight further movement in the direction of giving the Mayor of London more power. But there comes a point where national governments just think national governments, know better. No evidence for that whatsoever. If you look at the handling of recent, well, let's put it crudely, I mean, the handling of the pandemic, it's self-evident that it would have been better handled in a number of ways if subnational government had been involved more. Track and trace, absolutely obviously, but not only that. So, but I think the difficulty in wishing for, and I do wish for more devolution to cities and indeed across England, is that national governments never quite believe that people at the subnational level, be it in London or elsewhere, are as good at doing things as central government is, despite all the evidence over the years to the contrary. In fact, if you look at some of the things in the book about what mayors have done, and you mentioned a couple, I mean, congestion charge, Oyster card, the bike scheme, Sadiq Khan's attempts to reduce pollution, national government finds it much harder to do this stuff, and certainly to do it successfully. National government famously cannot deliver IT-based, computer-based reforms to its own operations. Whereas in London, particularly the Oyster card and as it originally was, and congestion charging have required enormously complex IT and computer systems which have worked. So I think that government should just relax, let subnational government do more, devolve more power. In fact, if you devolve more power, there's lots of evidence people trust government more, and we definitely need more trust in government at the moment.
But you say that Boris Johnson may find that his experience as a post-COVID Prime Minister is closer to that of Clement Attlee than of his wartime hero, Winston Churchill. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, I mean, Boris Johnson wrote a book about Churchill. Churchill's clearly a big inspiration for him, and Churchill is a very, very important figure in the UK's history, of course. But Churchill was succeeded, at least in 1945, by Clement Attlee, who, as the leader of the post-war Labour government, there through visible austerity, trying to rebuild the state or build, nationalising companies and so on. And it looks to me as if post-COVID, post-Brexit, the Johnson government is going to have to live with very difficult economic times, and separately, with having to think about nationalising, or as they will describe it, helping a whole range of industries which have been negatively affected by some of the consequences of Brexit. And so in that sense, while wishing, I think Boris Johnson would like to be the sort of powerful, optimistic leader that Churchill was, he'll end up in a world that resembles Clement Attlee's rather more than Churchill's.
Yeah, well, let's hope we don't get round to having to have rationing, which of course was another great feature of that particular period of our economy. So Tony Travers, thank you very much for your insights and your time, and for all the things you do for London. Thank you.
Ditto to you, Peter. Thank you very much.